Okay, so I got both dehydrators going here. I got the oven dehydrating some berries, and I am making pemmican. Typically, I've made it out of the game meat that I've harvested, so moose, deer, or bison, but I'm out of game meat. So I used beef this time, and what I did was I bought a large brisket from the store. It was about $90. I was actually surprised with how much actually fat was on that brisket. There's a lot more fat on cows than there are on wild game animals, but it made it sort of challenging because when you're cutting your meat for jerky, you ideally want to have as little fat in it as possible, and that just means that the jerky and of course eventually the pemmican will be preserved for longer. It'll last longer and it won't go bad. So I did the best I could removing all that fat. Good thing was that all that fat meant I had a lot to render. So I rendered that beef suet. Suet is the name of hard raw chunks of beef fat. So I rendered that suet down into tallow, and tallow is essentially rendered beef fat. So you just heat it slowly, it turns to liquid, and of course it'll eventually harden, and that just lasts forever. But pemmican is typically a combination of dried pulverized animal meat, rendered animal fat, and dried pulverized berries. This was actually the fuel, if you will, of the fur trade before the bison herds were exhausted. The Métis on the Canadian plains in what's now Manitoba, one time was Assiniboia. It included some of the states. At one time, they were kind of key in the pemmican trade, and they made a lot of this stuff, and they sold it to the Northwest Company, which was, them and the Hudson Bay Company were the kings of the fur trade, the driving companies behind the fur trade, and the pemmican was used to feed the voyageurs. And the voyageurs were people that paddled large birch bark canoes all over the country, transporting furs and trade goods. And the owners preferred pemmican to a diet of salt pork or pea soup because it was lighter and took up more space. And even though pemmican can last a very, very long time, it will eventually go bad. So because sometimes the pemmican would take months to get to, say, Montreal, where some of these fur brigades left from, it would be rancid at the time, and it took the voyageurs' guts about a year to get used to eating pemmican, because oftentimes it was rancid and sometimes even crawling if it got wet or something like that in transit along the way, which is of course all too possible. But if it's made properly, it can last for an extremely long time. No processed food, it's all completely whole food. And when you're getting the exercise that you're getting when you're traveling by canoe in the backcountry, eating the lard and stuff like that is something your body needs and something your body burns off. So it has more calories, it's lighter, and it tastes better than your store-bought energy bars. And that's what I take pemmican for. The voyageurs would eat about 6 pounds of it per day once their guts got used to it. That was key in the fur trade era. It's of course key now. And it's still probably the best trail food that you can bring while you're out there on multi-week tough trips. And that's what I make it for. My brother and I have an Arctic expedition coming up. We have to go light because it's a very far flight on our float plane to access these remote areas in the Canadian Barrenlands that we're going to be visiting, and so we need to go as light as possible, and that's why I'm making pemmican and a whole bunch of other dehydrated meals. Pemmican is a nutritious trail food that packs a lot of calories for its weight and bulk. Pemmican is made out of dried pulverized red meat, or sometimes fish, dried pulverized berries, and rendered animal fat. When preparing the meat, you want to cut the meat very thinly and remove as much fat as possible. Lay the thin strips of meat out on your dehydrator and set the dehydrator to about 150, and you want to let it dehydrate for a very long time. 15 to even 20 hours is okay. You want those strips of meat to be brittle and snap when you bend them. Dehydrators can be used and are effective, but you can also use your oven and just hang the strips of meat on your oven rack, or even stick a toothpick through it and then hang it between the oven racks, allowing each end of the toothpick to sit on a different piece of rack. And when making pemmican, you want to make that beef jerky even drier than if it was just jerky. After you've dried out your meat, you want to pulverize it. A great thing to use is a blender or a coffee grinder. Now, if you have a small coffee grinder, the process can be a little bit tedious because it doesn't do a whole lot at once, but it does a good job. And that's what I use here, is a coffee grinder. Now, while you're doing this, you can also be rendering fat. This is just rendered pig fat. Lard is rendered pig fat. You can buy that from the store. Melt it down if if you're in the bush, over the fire, if you're at home on the stove or in the microwave, and that makes life a lot easier. But if you're rendering down chunks of game meat such as bear, beaver, or if you happen to get a deer or moose with any fat on it, you cut off the large raw chunks of meat and you heat that up slowly. You can just do it on your stove on a low temperature and it'll slowly turn to liquid, and that liquid is the rendered animal fat. Then you're going to want to pour that off and strain all the chunks out, and the hardened chunks of brown crispy fat that are used afterwards can be crushed up and sprinkled into stew to add flavor and whatnot. Now you want to strain it. I just use an orange juice strainer and a piece of paper towel, and I slowly poured the rendered fat through it, and I transferred it to a mason jar where it will keep for a very long time. Now, you don't have to do these things in any specific order, but the next thing I did in this process is dry out the berries. And I like to use blueberries. I bought bags of frozen blueberries from the store. It's a lot cheaper than buying fresh blueberries. However, fresh blueberries taste a lot better in the pemmican. So if you're doing a small batch, you might want to consider doing that. And of course, nothing would be better than wild blueberries that you pick. So I use a food processor to blast those berries up. I can actually just grind them up from frozen, and I lay them on a sheet of parchment paper, and I put them right onto the oven rack, and I slide that oven rack in the oven and set the oven as low as it will go. 140 is good, 130, 140, somewhere around there. If you go too high, the pemmican might have a slight burnt flavor. Some ovens don't go that low. So if you have to set your oven to 150, that's probably okay. In your dehydrators, you're gonna wanna go at about 135, 140 max. And you're gonna wanna let that sit for a long time. Again, often the berries might take even longer than the meat. So 14 to 20 hours, no problem, until you make a fruit leather. The next thing you're gonna wanna do is you're gonna wanna remove the dried berries from the parchment paper. And again, you're gonna want to blend those up until they're in a fine powder. I find that, again, a coffee grinder is the best thing to use for this. Usually doing the berries goes a lot faster than pulverizing the meat with the grinder goes. One of the very interesting things about it is when you start to make pemmican yourself, you realize what a process it is. So, in Canadian history, where you learn about the Métis and you learn about the pemmican trade and how they used to make large amounts to it and sell, thousands and thousands of pounds to the Northwest Company, you hear that and you think, okay, but then when you make pemmican yourself, you're like, wow, this is a major process, and it really gives you a much better idea beyond what words can explain how much work it was to actually make these massive quantities of pemmican, render all that fat, pick all those berries, hunt all the animals, butcher them, hang up the meat and dry it. Just an enormous amount of work and process. So that's one really cool thing that I learned from this process, is it really gives me a much better idea of what it was really like back in the day. Then you're gonna wanna heat up your rendered animal fat and make sure it's in liquid form. Get that ready along with your dried pulverized meat and your dried pulverized berries. And then with a measuring cup, you want to measure equal parts of all of those things. So for example, 1 cup of dried pulverized meat, 1 cup of dried pulverized berries, and 1 cup of liquid rendered animal fat. Pour all of those things together into a large bowl, give them a good mix, and then pour them out into a pan that is lined with parchment paper. Smooth it out, let it sit in the fridge for a couple hours so that tallow hardens, and you will have a delicious slab of nutritious pemmican. Cut it up into bars and wrap it in parchment paper and store it in a Ziploc bag for your trip. And that pemmican will keep for a very long time. So that's how you make pemmican. Try it out. It's a fun thing to do. It really connects you with history, and it is an excellent source of energy while you're in the bush. Give it a shot.